There's a lot more to food than what meets the fork. But sometimes you have to take things with a grain of salt. Coming up, some of our fanciest foods weren't always so, well, fancy. Did lobster bust out of prison before it was a VIP? How did creme brulee become the cream of the crop? And did champagne's fizz almost cause it to fizzle? Are they old wives' tales, ancient elixirs, or just clever marketing ploys? Every bite you take has a story, every morsel a myth. Is it baked with fact or flavored with fiction? Grilled, steamed, or broiled, lobster's market price usually leaves us feeling shell-shocked when the bill arrives. Oh, yeah. This crazy crustacean has become synonymous with luxury, excess, and adult-sized bibs. But was lobster born with a silver spoon in its mandible? Or did it claw its way up to the penthouse? Is lobster a fraud? From Maine to Mexico, people have shelled out for this succulent seafood for hundreds of years. Through the Middle Ages and Renaissance, lobsters were enjoyed by the upper classes at feasts all across Europe. They were even once thought to have medicinal properties.
Take 2 of these and call me in the morning.
But while the European lobster was very rare and considered a delicacy, according to self-described food nerd Dan Kohler, that wasn't the case in North America.
In North America in the 1600s, the coastline was littered with lobsters and shellfish. You have to remember, at this point, that coastline had not had much sea travel at all. So these creatures were able to grow and colonize unfettered. And actually, lobsters washed up on shore in piles sometimes 2 feet high.
The promised land, right? Wrong.
I mean, a pile of lobsters sounds great, except at that point it was trash. Abundance of anything breeds distaste, right? Mm-hmm. Lobster was used by the Native Americans as fertilizer. They were using it as fish bait, and servants would even put in their contracts that they were to be served lobster no more than twice a week. Lobster was actually food for prisoners at some point because it was the poor man's meat. If it was served to you more than a couple times a week in prison, that was deemed cruel and unusual punishment.
Anything but lobster, please.
So what changed? How did the lobster go from low class to upper crustacean? Well, not with etiquette classes, but with a fishy sales pitch.
Anyone who hasn't seen trash before doesn't actually know that it's trash. So as the railroads begin to expand across America in the 1800s, transportation authorities began to sell lobster on the train lines as this delicious meat. People bought it.
And loved it. So, thanks to trains and savvy menu planning, lobster clawed its way to popularity across the U.S. But as demand rose, so did the price.
Once you get a taste of something, you crave it, you want it. So when these passengers got to the coast, they were requesting it because you want the freshest version of your favorite food.
While the lobster is known as one of the world's greatest food delicacies, speedy transportation to the packing house is an absolute necessity. He is speedily transferred, sometimes 1,000 miles inland.
The price of lobster instantly skyrockets, and actually to this day, the price of lobster is directly tied to how far it has to be transported.
But are lobster really worth their weight in drawn butter? Or are they in over their heads?
I don't think lobster's worth the price.
I'd rather eat other seafood.
It's all about the butter you dip it in. I think women are impressed when you order lobster.
Pigs are sexy.
Sexy or not, a huge factor in lobster's success was actually in the way it was prepared.
Anything that you think is a strange part of the animal is only strange until you figure out how to cook it. Lobsters were strange animals until we figured out the best way to cook them. And if you look at cookbooks pre-1800, you're finding recipes that suggest you boil lobsters 10 minutes per pound, which would have provided something worse than shoe rubber. I mean, that's unbelievably tough. And as we move from the 1800s to the 1900s, you start roasting lobster. We found other ways to preserve the succulence of the lobster meat. I would say one of the first things we do, culinarily speaking, with any meat is let's see how it tastes with butter. And that definitely is the classic with lobster at this point. Butter, lemon, and garlic, and you're done.
Today, lobster is definitely making the culinary rounds, but its posh persona has taken another tasty turn.
Lobster's everywhere these days. You find it in food trucks, you find it in gastropubs, and really, restaurants use it to elevate any meal. So you put it in mac and cheese, all of a sudden you have fancy lobster mac and cheese. You find it in burritos, you find it in tacos, you can get lobster rolls.
Lobster? More like lobstar. The versatile lobster has managed to reinvent itself through the ages, successfully navigating both ends of the social food ladder. But before you go all gaga, there's one more dark secret you should know.
I think if people knew the origin of the word lobster, this would not be nearly as expensive a menu item. It comes from the Old English word lop, which means spider, and the Latin word locusta, which means crustacean. So spider crustacean, if we put that on a menu, I don't think people would be buying as much.
Well, whatever you want to call it, lobster is so elegant. It's the one food I don't mind playing with. The Sicilian defense. Sushi is one of America's most exotic and expensive foreign delicacies. But have we swallowed a lie? Hook, line, and sinker? Is sushi just street food? Find out next on Food, Fact or Fiction. In America, fresh fish on rice has become a popular luxury food. Sushi, which actually refers to the fermented rice underneath, is one of the most expensive foods in the country. But is this cuisine's origin more humble than hoped? In the early 1800s, sushi started out as simple street food. That's right, just like hot dogs. And in 1824, Chef Hanaya Yohei created sushi's modern profile. He would quickly hand-shape vinegared rice and add a slice of fresh fish from the river next to his stall. The portability of the portions and speed of service was a hit with busy workers and random passers-by. Soon, street vendors all over Tokyo were copying Yohei's style, and the masses ate it up. Today, thanks to LA's food truck craze, sushi has found its way back to the streets. Tanoshimimasu. There's one item that epitomizes an elegant end to an upscale meal. It's la crème brûlée. Oh la la. That classy French name, that delicate crust, that oh so rich, silky custard. Downright sinful. Oh, mon Dieu. Okay, that's the limit of my French. But crème brûlée wasn't always a member of high society. How did crème brûlée become la crème de la crème? You didn't hear it from me, but crème brûlée comes from very modest beginnings. Beneath the glitz and glamour of that shimmering caramelized sugar sheet is simply an egg custard. We know the ancient Romans experimented with custard recipes.
I came, I saw, I custard.
In the Middle Ages, custards, in the form of pastry fillings, found their way into many a hungry knight's stomach. And it wasn't the French who introduced custard to that incredible crust, it was their rivals, the English.
Sacre bleu.
But according to food historian Sarah Lohman, the crust and the custard didn't hook up until the 17th century.
There have been custards made with milk, cream, eggs, and sugars for a very long time, but creme brulee has its roots in a British dessert called burnt cream.
Burnt cream? That sounds more like a disaster than a dessert.
So burnt cream is this egg custard that has this caramelized sugar top. So first you'd make the custard. That would be made with egg yolks and sugar and cream that's been heated too. The hot cream is poured over the eggs and that starts to slowly cook them. You have to whisk all the time while you're doing it. Then that goes in the oven. Afterwards is when you put the sugar on top and then use an implement called a salamander, heat it over an open fire to sizzle the top and create that brulee crust.
Legend has it the inventor of burnt cream was a culinary student at Cambridge's Trinity College. So technically it was dorm food. Think 17th century ramen. After graduating, our hero was hired as a teaching fellow, and his custard creation was quickly adopted by Trinity's kitchen staff.
But Trinity College, they had their school coat of arms so that you could brand the top of your burnt cream, and I guess then everyone would know it was yours.
And with that scorched, sugary seal of approval, it came to be known as Cambridge Burnt Cream. But how did this 17th century dorm food become a 21st century delicacy? We'll crack the code when Food, Fact or Fiction returns. Creme brulee is one of the coolest creations to ever ride the dessert trolley. But this French-sounding masterpiece is really an Old English dish called burnt cream. So how did this stovetop Cinderella become the belle of the ball? It's time to spill the vanilla beans.
Well, we have our egg custard, and now we have our burnt or bruleed top, and there needs to be this third element for it to really be a modern creme brulee, and that is vanilla. Vanilla is the seed pod of an orchid, and before the 1840s, it was not widely available. It becomes more available in the second half of the 19th century because it's being cultivated in French colonies like Madagascar. Although the origins of this dessert come out of England, it's probably in France that the vanilla bean met the burnt cream.
The French loved their vanilla and started adding it to all sorts of recipes like ice cream, hot cocoa, and most likely, burnt cream.
In the 19th century, when vanilla became cheaper and more readily available, people just went crazy for it. Serving a custard or an ice cream with vanilla showed that you had money to buy it and to pay people to make this dessert for you too. But I actually think vanilla is really, really complex and wonderful, and human beings have this insatiable desire for it. That's probably part of the reason that creme brulee became so popular as a dessert.
As for the name, no one's really sure when burnt cream became creme brulee. But keep in mind, they still mean exactly the same thing. And the French translation was all it took for the world to take notice. By the 1970s, creme brulee was a bright light in New York's food skyline.
French food and French cuisine have always been admired and emulated in the United States, but in the 1970s and 1980s, particularly in New York, a lot of new fine French dining restaurants started opening up, places like Le Cirque. And on these menus, they started serving creme brulee, and people just went crazy for it. And in the early 1980s, the New York Times declared it the dessert of the year. So it went from these humble beginnings to being the finish to a very, very expensive fine French dining experience. And it then became served in some of the best American restaurants too. And even though it was a big fad, it still stuck around. People still love this dessert.
From ice cream and coffee to donuts and cupcakes, creme brulee has lent its signature flavor to many of our guilty pleasures. Bon appetit. Or should I say, cheers, mate. If there was ever a delicacy that shouted VIP, it would be these exquisitely edible black pearls, which can really set you back. But was caviar once nothing more than a complimentary bar snack? We'll burst the bubble on some champagne wishes and caviar dreams next on Food, Fact or Fiction. Caviar, one of the world's most expensive edibles. Forget about oil. This is the real black gold. But did you know that these exquisite eggs were once served in saloons for free? According to Aristotle, caviar was a European luxury dating back as far as the 4th century BC. But it wasn't until the 19th century that Americans acquired the taste. Would you believe we once had an abundance of sturgeon that produced roes so good it may as well have been Russian?
Wow, that's good.
In fact, caviar was so plentiful, it was given away as a salty saloon snack to make patrons thirsty, just like peanuts are today.
Yo, where's my caviar?
Unfortunately, as with most things, we overdid it. By the 1920s, we had wiped out our native sturgeon, sending prices through the roof. And there they stayed. But what about caviar's time-honored comrade? Champagne, the provocative pop of the cork, those tiny bubbles tickling your nose. It's the wine of royals and rappers alike. But was this effervescent drink always a member of high society? Or was it once poured straight down the drain? Did a fluke put champagne in the flute? Say what you will, but champagne comes from one place and one place only. A province east of Paris called, you guessed it, Champagne. Bubbly from any other region is merely sparkling wine. And believe it or not, that's the law.
Step away from the champagne bottle.
The Romans were the first to plant vineyards in Champagne around the 5th century. Eventually, the vineyards were owned by the region's churches, and monks produced wine for religious ceremonies and coronation festivals. But hold on. None of this brotherly booze had any bubbles. So how did this fine wine get its fizz? Our own Dan Kohler knows the answer.
Before the 1600s, there was definitely no champagne as we know it. In fact, at that point, to stop up wine bottles, you would take rope or hemp that had been soaked in oil and jam it in there. And that is completely gas permeable, so you're never going to get anything that is carbonated.
Later, the French switched to corks to keep their precious cargo safe, but it took some erratic temperature changes in the Champagne region to put the bubbles in the bottle.
Temperature fluctuation definitely has something to do with it. Wine goes through one fermentation, but if you take those barrels, there's still yeast in them. Now, if the barrels are kept too cold, that yeast doesn't die, it just takes a nap, goes to sleep. If the temperature changes, and you've already poured it out of the barrels into bottles and put a cap on it, well then when the yeast wakes up and it starts fermenting again, what we have now is called the méthode champenoise. It's a secondary fermentation.
That's where all those trademark bubbles come from. And believe me, there's a lot of them.
The champagne bottle is super pressurized. Inside a bottle of champagne, you can find 49 million bubbles. But I'm not sure how we're counting.
But in 17th century France, wine bubbles were considered a major flaw and had the region's vintners mortified.
Champagne was originally thought of as an aberration because wine didn't have bubbles for centuries. So if you get a batch with bubbles, it's probably bad. We should chuck the whole thing in case we die drinking it. Champagne was referred to as the devil's wine because in cellars, in abbeys, you would have exploding bottles of wine. And so anything that's exploding in the cellar of an abbey, you must think must be the work of the devil.
It seemed there was only one solution. Time to bring in a holy heavy hitter.
According to the French, Dom Pérignon was brought in to solve the crisis of the devil's wine at the Benedictine Abbey Haute-Vière. Realistically, what Dom did was when he came in, he figured out, you know what? Exploding bottles, maybe not such a bad thing. We shouldn't solve the problem by getting rid of the bubbles. We should solve the problem by making a truly spectacular bottle of champagne.
By experimenting with blends and using better corks and stronger bottles, Dom had turned the problem into a party. But while Dom Pérignon dedicated 47 years of his life to mastering champagne, is he really the one we should raise our glass to?
Dom Pérignon is the main name that we associate with champagne, even though it's mostly a myth. Christopher Merritt should be the one who got all that honor. Christopher Merritt was a doctor in the mid-1600s in England, and he figured out that if you add a little bit of sugar to a bottle of wine after it's gone through the first fermentation and then cap it, the yeast will kickstart a secondary fermentation.
And he did it about 50 years sooner than our monkish friend. But apparently the English lacked that magic touch.
The English may have figured out how to trap it in a bottle, but they're crummy winemakers, so the French really perfected it.
The English and the French love a good food fight. But perfection or not, it took royalty to finally make champagne the toast of the town.
Champagne was definitely not an instant hit. It took a lot of work. After Louis XIV dies in 1715, his nephew, Philip II, is named regent of France. And Philip II loved champagne. It's rumored that he served it every night at dinner. And so the common people wanted to follow in their leader's footsteps, and they began to drink champagne. As the royals do, so follow the people.
Look at me! I'm a royal! I'm a royal!
Today, the champagne market is through the roof, and for good reason. The most expensive bottles can go for well over $2 million a pop. I got this one on sale. Beautiful, isn't she? We've established how some of our favorite luxury foods went from rags to riches. Lobsters were once only fit for ungrateful prisoners. Creme brulee is just a fancy French name for British burnt cream. And bubbly was almost poured right down the drain of history. No meal is complete without a spoonful of fact and a dash of fiction.